First, open up ZBrush. You're probably going to see something like this, where you have this area at the top of ZBrush is called the light box. Now, I've actually rearranged the interface of ZBrush, so it's going to look different if you follow tutorials and things like that. I've loaded my own interface via Preferences, Configuration, and Load UI. You can sort of restore the standard UI, which looks like this, just to show you that. I'm going to restore my custom UI. And I've actually got a new version of this that I'm probably going to get you guys to install later on. But for me, I just kind of put my most commonly used tools sort of at the bottom and on the right-hand side, just for accessibility. And I've also made a couple of custom shortcuts. But to come back to this, Lightbox is a button you can hit here on the left side. So you can kind of open and close that, or you can hit the comma key on your keyboard, and that'll sort of pop that up. So what this basically is sort of like the folder structure inside of ZBrush. So you can sort of see preset demo projects. There's spheres, pre-built heads, bodies. There's a dog. There's a folder for jewelry. There's an old demo folder. Then you've got tools, which are basically like the models inside of ZBrush. You've got brushes, so you've actually got a lot of custom brushes, and basically what they are is they are like sculpting brushes. Some of them are move brushes, some of them are things like slice or cutting brushes. Some of them are sort of like regular brushes, but they have like a texture inside of them, which allows you to kind of make unique patterns very, very quickly. Then we've got a very, very brief bank of textures, alphas, which are basically kind of like black and white images, like an alpha channel from Photoshop, but people make these from either by hand painting, sometimes via sculpting, or by photoshopping images to get things like skin texture, pores, so you can very, very quickly generate a lot of detail and texture in a model. We've also got the material folder, so again, a lot of this stuff is sort of accessible just by clicking on, if I click on the material button over here in the right corner, we have access to materials. So anyways, a couple of important tabs I should mention are the quick save. So I believe by default ZBrush saves every 20 minutes under quick save. So every 20 minutes it'll save. So these are quick saves from yesterday, just kind of opening different files and working on different things. So if you ever have a crash or anything, or if you forget to save, you can sometimes go back there to access your files. So what I usually do though, I usually kind of keep Lightbox off. I either start with a sphere most times. You can start your own way. There's plenty of ways to start. And the main way to kind of navigate around ZBrush, if you've got a sphere, so if you don't have an object, you can kind of go into the tool palette on the right hand side. This is basically where you spend like 90% of your life in ZBrush is on the right hand side in this tool palette. So like Maya, ZBrush has these preset shapes like spheres, cones, cylinders. It's got a special kind of gear option as well. And sort of like Maya too, it has sort of its own startup settings. So before you start editing and cutting, you want to kind of check out your mesh. So to sort of look at the mesh settings, I do one of a couple things. First thing is I hit Shift F, which is the draw polyframe option. So what that does is it shows you a wireframe on top of your model. Now, if you're starting on ZBrush, you might do this, right? So if you guys click and drag, left click and drag, or with your tablet pen down and drag, you may notice that there's this weird thing that happens, right? So what this is ZBrush actually started as a 2.5D program. So it's sort of like a cheesy knockoff of Photoshop that allowed you to load 3D objects but treat them like brush strokes. So what this workspace is actually like a Photoshop document. So it's actually just like a document with pixels instead of a traditional 3D viewport, and each pixel has three-dimensional depth. So it's a little strange, but you've got these 2.5D brushes. So this is kind of like the old school part of ZBrush. And if I hold Alt and start, Alt oftentimes is a negative brush, so you can see I can actually sort of sketch this stuff away. Right, so you can drag and drop as many objects on the canvas as you want, but this doesn't allow you to actually edit your model or do a unique mesh. So I think what sort of happened way back in the early days of ZBrush, they realized, well, we can use 3D models to kind of just throw down onto kind of this 2.5D canvas, but we can actually go in and edit a single model and do a lot of complex 3D sculpting with it. So instead of just keeping it as this sort of sketching program that had 3D models that you can use as a brush, they decided, well, why don't we, go in and actually enable people to edit the model. So the way to do that, so this is, like I said, a document space, like a Photoshop document. So when you make a mistake and you drag something out and leave a copy of it on the canvas, you want to hit Control N, which clears your document. But if you want to go in, so if I left click and drag out a sphere and I want to edit that sphere, I have to hit T on the keyboard, and now it just allows me to kind of rotate around that single object to edit or sculpt it. So it's basically left click and drag off the model to rotate around. So that's a good way to just kind of move around the object. Now, right now, if I try to click on it with a brush, it says, to enable sculpting, please convert the 3D primitive to a polymesh 3D by pressing Make Polymesh 3D in the tool palette. Now, before I do that, that's over here. I'll just draw your attention to it by kind of highlighting it there. So Make Polymesh 3D is the button you actually want to click to start editing. But a lot of times before I do that, if I've got a basic primitive, usually I like to plan things out a little bit. I may go to Initialize, and you can squash things on one axis or squash them on another axis or multiple axes. Right? So a lot of times you're kind of thinking about blocking, thinking about changing the shape of your object. Maybe you actually want to plan something that's a bit low poly, so you may reduce the polygon counts here. And there's coverage, so I can actually have this thing slice as well, in a way. So each of the primitives does have these kinds of options, like the cone. I can taper the top or not taper the top. I can adjust the divisions. I can have an inner radius, so it's actually more like a cone. So these things can be useful if you're building objects that you need sort of just simple edits to, and don't need to do a ton of sculpting on or editing on. But anyways, going back to the sphere, like I said, most cases I will just simply click on Make Polymesh 3D. So if you guys have a sphere or any kind of mesh object, once you click Make Polymesh 3D, it becomes kind of a live editable mesh that you can now sculpt on. So if you literally left click and drag on the surface, you can start sculpting. So if you want to, so some quick shortcuts I use. So I hit S on my keyboard. S allows you to get to a bigger or smaller draw size. It's also at the top, by the way, so all the brush settings are pretty much at the top bar of ZBrush. So S is draw size. U is for the intensity or the strength of the brush. So if you find it's, I'm going to hit Shift F again, by the way, to turn off the wireframe, but if you hit U, it's the intensity. So if I have let's say a small brush here, it's not giving me a strong brush stroke. I'll hit U again and crank up the intensity, and I'll get a much stronger brush stroke. What happens when you hit T, or if you click on the Edit button, that enables you to edit the last brush stroke with a 3D model. So once you put a 3D model on the canvas, right, if I turn this Edit button off, it's just going to leave copies of my model on the canvas. So if I want to actually edit, I have to hit T. Then if I want to clear all the other brush strokes, I'll hit Control N, and now I can edit the last brush stroke, which is actually like sculpting or modeling, right? My custom interface, by the way, is add a bunch of my most used brushes at the bottom. So the first 5 or 6, let's say on the lower left here, but on the top row, the standard, the dam standard, the move brush, clay tubes, clay buildup, snake hook, and inflate, for me are my most used brushes. So you can kind of click on those if you want to play around with the different brush types, but I do want to talk a little bit about rotating and moving around. So if you left click and drag off the model, you can kind of rotate around. If you need to recenter, so sometimes the pivot may look a little weird, it's not necessarily centered on the object, you can hit F, which frames the model just like in Maya, so it centers the object. And if you then start to rotate around, it will be centered. If you want to move the object in the viewport sort of left to right, up and down, you have to hold Alt and put your pen down or left click and drag. So that moves it up and down. And if you keep your pen down or if you keep holding your left mouse button and let go of Alt, now you can zoom in. So it's a bit of a weird setup, but You zoom in by holding Alt, then you put your pen down or left click and hold. Then you let go of Alt and move your pen up and down or your mouse up and down, or towards and away from you basically if you're using a pen, a mouse. So that allows you to zoom in. Now the reason it's set up that way is that virtually every Wacom tablet in existence has Alt, Control, and Shift buttons mapped to the tablet surface. So you can quickly access a lot of different options via some combination of Alt, Control, and Shift, okay? So I'm going to hold Alt up and down and then let go. So I do this Alt function a lot when I'm sculpting. So yeah, you may see in this, I've got this little pop-up for shortcuts, right? It may show left mouse button, but that's the same as when you left click and hold the mouse button, it's the same as putting your tablet pen on the tablet surface. So that's sort of the way to kind of navigate around, right? And then hitting F if you need to reframe. So you can zoom really, really close. And you may wonder, well, how can I move around when I'm really, really close, right? Because you're just going to start sculpting on the surface if you hold Alt. ZBrush has this little thin border around the outer edges that allows you to kind of then zoom out, right? Or to move things over. So that little border around there is sort of a safe zone for you to continue to zoom in or out from the model. So with the brush stroke, if you're brushing with a standard brush, it actually is pulling out by default. So let me increase my strength again here. So as I brush out, right, it's pulling mesh up from the surface here, right? And then if I hold Alt, it'll dig in. So Alt pushes in oftentimes. So if you take a look at the kind of upper middle bar of ZBrush, you see there's Z add, Z subtract. So some brushes by default are set to subtract. Many brushes are set to add, which basically kind of adds volume or adds more mass essentially to the object. And if you hold Shift, what that does is kind of helps smooth things back. So it kind of blends things a bit better, right? So that's really, really useful. So that's another really important shortcut. So Alt, like I said, if the direction is positive, Alt will make it negative. If the direction is negative on a brush, Alt will make it positive. And when you hold Shift and brush over the model, it'll sort of smooth it out. If you want to work in symmetry, which is very often, if you hit X, X activates the symmetry, right? So if you're kind of rotating around trying to find your center point, now you can sculpt in a symmetrical fashion. And a lot of times too, if you want to kind of see your ground floor, sort of like Maya's home grid, you can hit Shift P, which is the shortcut, or this button over here on the sort of miniature toolbar, I guess you could say, on the right side of ZBrush. That sort of just gives you a sense of grounding in the world. So now you can start sort of sculpting and doing your thing in symmetry, right? So I often kind of just use that in the very first few minutes of a sculpt, and then I turn it off because I do find it a little bit distracting visually. So yeah, I will usually just switch that off and keep going. The question is, how do you change the axis of the symmetry? Well, I usually don't, just so I make sure when I sculpt something that I'm looking at the front of the model, and when I send it to Maya, it's staring back at me in the same way. But you can change the axis by going to Transform, and you see there's actually an X, a Y, a Z. So if I do, there's Z symmetry, kind of on front to back. You can actually activate multiple axes of symmetry. So you could say, I want X and Z. So now, if I do this, it's going to actually sculpt on 4 points instead of just 2, right? Left to right, top to bottom, or front to back. Not only that, interestingly enough, if we turn all of these off, let's say I go to Y symmetry and hit radial. Now I have a radial symmetry, which allows me to sculpt all the way around, which is really cool, right? So you can start to pull things out this way. It's extremely, extremely powerful and really fantastic. So the default, like I said, is X. I usually like to start with X, so again, I know exactly where I'm facing, but yeah, there are situations where you need Y or Z-based symmetry or a combination of any of those three, right? Now, the other question is often, well, how do I get more mesh? So there's a lot of ways actually. And I find if you stick with one, you want to stick with that one for quite a while. So the first one is to go to geometry, and you can divide your mesh to make it look smoother. So in Maya, I've mentioned this, if you hit the number 3 on your keyboard, that actually subdivides the model. So if you had 1,000 polygons, each single polygon gets divided into 4 new ones. So that 1,000 becomes 4,000. If you and I believe the subdivision level is 2 levels in Maya by default. So 1,000 polys will actually divide twice, meaning it'll go from 1,000 to actually 4,000 and then 16. So it's kind of the same idea here. This is 8,000. If I divide it once, it multiplies by 4, which is roughly 32,000. If I divide it again, it'll be roughly 4 times that. And you can keep going. What's great about this is you can go up to like millions. Although I strongly urge people to stick as low as possible, as long as possible, because when you start modeling, you don't want to get into too much detail work, right? And the quicker you start doing detail work, the quicker you're going to have to start erasing the detail work to fix major shape issues. So it's like anything, right? You kind of need to do your construction work first, do the big skeletal part of it, and then slowly refine in. So usually my method is work really low and slowly move up in resolution as I need to sculpt. So I go from big masses and big details to smaller. I go from low res to high res, right? So that's I think a good working tip. It's very tempting to just go like 10 million polys and start sculpting everything at once, but generally speaking, I think it's good to work in large shapes, simple shapes first, right? And what's good about this is you can go up and down in resolution here on the right-hand side. So, you know, I know a lot of people when they look at ZBrush, look at all these like little sub-menus, right? It looks really scary and intimidating, but what I suggest is sort of take it one piece at a time. Just kind of look at 1 or 2 little menus and sub-menus at a time. I mean, this one you will live in quite a lot. By the way, the shortcut for divisions, to go up and down divisions, is Shift-D goes down, D goes up. And if you need to add a new division, it's Control-D, which will then create a new subdivision. So I actually map these oftentimes to a couple of buttons on my Wacom tablet. So you can customize the software so you can just quickly zip up and down subdivision levels. So that's one way to get more mesh or more polygons. I'm going to delete my higher for now. One problem I have, you know, sometimes when you start with something like a sphere, it's got this kind of pinching at the top, and sometimes the mesh can still be really uneven, right? So if I go into the move brush and I want to pull something out, you see you start to get some really bad stretching. So there's actually a kind of special mode for this. So this is a different way to add mesh to your model. I'll show you 2 versions or 2 variations of how to add more mesh as you are doing conceptual work. Let's say if you're doing something experimental, you don't know the full shape yet. There's something called Dynamesh. So I'm going to undo and just show you this at a really low res. What Dynamesh does is it kind of cuts in like a grid from 6 sides: the front, the back, the left, the right, the top, and the bottom. And it uses this resolution slider. So it's, imagine like a plane with a resolution of 16 edges going up and down and left and right, cutting through the model from the front, from the side, from the back, from the top, and from the bottom. So it's a really great way, you know, to pull out new mesh. So if I grab a move tool, right, and I start to really stretch it, in this mode, if I control, click, and drag, it will redistribute the polygons. So again, let's say I use Snake Hook. Snake Hook does some really cool stuff. It allows you to make these really weird loops. So I'll pull this out, control, click, and drag, pull it out some more, control, click, and drag. And maybe I'm going to inflate that because it's a little thin here. So I'll try to inflate that mesh. Control, click, and drag. Inflate some more. So Dynamesh is really fantastic for this kind of stuff. It's very good for conceptual work. And again, if you need more resolution, you just up the resolution a little bit. And I recommend going up slowly. In this case, yeah, you got to be careful. Sometimes if your mesh has really weird holes in it, it can actually do some really gross stuff. So I'm going to be careful. I'm going to up the resolution a little bit earlier just so I don't create any of these crazy gaps. There. So you can see actually now there's a lot more resolution. In this case, it's actually very, very dense. So I'm going to just drop it down a little bit, sort of in between the two levels I had. There we go. Like I said, I like to keep things low and build up slowly. Mesh is a particular mode, and it does get a little confusing because there is actually a copy of this shortcut. So I'm going to just turn off Dynamesh to show you what I mean. So there is something called masking, right? So if I control click and drag on the model, I can protect certain areas of the model this way, which is great. So now I can sculpt along the borders, let's say, to get some other shape out. So oftentimes, you may want to protect certain delicate areas around the eyes or the mouth, or when I sculpt lips, for example, I often want to protect the upper lip and sculpt the lower, and then do the opposite. So masking, you can control tap off the model to flip the mask, control click and drag off the model to clear the mask. That's actually the same exact tool used in Dynamesh. So you can, mask an area. Let's say I brush around the area. I can control click and drag, that clears the mask. But if I do it a second time with Dynamesh mode activated, it will give me new mesh around it, right? So it's a little weird, but when Dynamesh is active, control click and drag will still clear a mask, but if there's no mask and you control click and drag, let me up the resolution a bit, it will give you new mesh, right? Or yeah, basically distribute the polys higher. So this is a mode I use a lot for concepting stuff. So I'll just show you maybe an old tool that I've got here. I did this in Dynamesh, and I basically was looking at the silhouette. So you guys have probably done a little bit of silhouette work. So I was just kind of like looking for some kind of interesting shapes and pushing and pulling things and Dynameshing as I went, and then adjusting the proportions a bit. So oftentimes I use things like flat color and the outline material for this sort of stuff. And then at a certain point I kind of fleshed out the details more, and I started working on the actual internal shapes and said, oh, this kind of looks like a cow. Although at this stage my friends reminded me correctly that it looked more like a deer. So I basically evolved this, but if you take a look, it's still just Dynamesh, right? It's got these like a bunch of little triangles, a bunch of quads. And eventually I fleshed it out, pulling it out from a head to a full torso and then into a full body. And what's great about this, let me just show you this. So this is still Dynamesh, I believe, at this stage, but it's a higher resolution Dynamesh. And then I could actually create a clean topology from that with a couple clicks. And it may not be 100% perfect for animation, but it's definitely a lot better for that purpose. And what's great is that, at any point in time you can kind of copy your sculpt and make a cleaner polygon version of it and send it to Maya so you can rig it, you can animate it, you can light and render it. So ZBrush is incredibly powerful. It's really changed, I think, how a lot of stuff is built in video games, film, and TV. So Dynamesh, like I said, Dynamesh is basically one mode you can use to pull out new kind of mesh. So a lot of times I'll start almost immediately in Dynamesh and start pushing and pulling things. So I'm going to just show you very quickly. Let's get into symmetry here. So I'll use the move brush. I want to actually show you this too. The move brush, there's a move brush. When you pull this thing out with the move brush, you see it kind of moves in a very linear or straight fashion from the point at which I grab to the point at which my mouse is located. There's also snake hook. Snake hook allows you to do more fluid sort of shapes, right? Again, let me Dynamesh that and then smooth it back. So Dynamesh is really, really useful. Now, I sort of teased you guys, right? We can make clean mesh with this. So a lot of times when you get kind of closer to a production model or something that you think you might want to animate or bring into Maya, usually what I would do is turn off Dynamesh. And we can simply go into geometry. There's a really great tool called Z-Remesh. Let's say I want this thing to be 1,000 poly, so I'll hit 1. This is in thousands of poly, so 1 is going to be 1,000. Hit Z-Remesh, and you'll see the model actually turn into a cleaner polygon quad-based model, like so. It's magic, right? I like to say ZBrush is alien technology from the future. It pretty much is that. And this Z-Remesh tool, again, it's not 100% perfect always, so faces it can still have a bit of a hard time with, or really complex mesh, but it's really, really great. And then at this point, this is when I would now say, okay, well, let's divide this once, twice, maybe 3 times, and start sculpting again on this and add new detail, right? So now we can start sculpting. I think my tablet's doing this weird thing where like every 5th brush stroke is not showing up properly, so I'm getting some weird jumpiness, but so those are sort of 2 methods. Like I said, there's subdividing the geometry, and then there's Dynamesh, and we can switch from mesh types, right, to this, sort of this looser, rougher kind of Dynamesh model, and we can switch it to a more organized polygon model with subdivisions, right? So we can go down and we can go up in subdivisions. Now, there's a 3rd type, so I don't want to confuse anybody too much. I know this is a lot of info, but if I delete higher, there's this new mode that was just added in called Sculptris Pro. All you really care about in ZBrush is the surface detail and the overall shape of the objects. So you can go from a Dynamesh to a more quad-based mesh, and you can go back again. So I often kind of work through a cycle where I Dynamesh a lot, then I start making more production-ready decisions, so I convert it to this organized kind of quad-based mesh. But then I realize, oh, I got to put a hole through the character, or I have to cut something off or add something. I just re-Dynamesh at a really, really high resolution so I don't lose any detail, add or subtract the parts that I want, and then convert back to quad-based mesh. And you can keep all the detail you have by transferring it. So I can show you that in that last tool I loaded. I think it was this one. So ZBrush has this amazing system. So this is like, I started getting into some detail work on this, right? And I made a copy of this, which is the poly edition, right? The quad edition, I should say. So I divided it a couple of times. Actually, I'll show you this from scratch. So let me just delete this one. So I took this model, right? This is the Dynamesh version. I duplicate it in the subtool. By the way, subtools are sort of like additional models. It's almost like in Maya when you do a combine. The difference here is that each model, each subtool can have its own subdivisions. So one model can have a bunch of subdivisions. Another model could be Dynamesh. Another one could just be a regular sphere. So like the eyeballs I often keep separate in a model. Let me turn off solo so you can see that. So the eyeballs are kind of separate here. I can work on them independently of the other objects. So subtools kind of keeps, you know, if you've got one character, it's got a bunch of costume pieces like a hat, a jacket. You know, the jacket might be a subtool, the hat will be a subtool, the eyes will be a subtool. So that's one way we can kind of keep stuff organized. And each subtool, like I said, can have its own number of subdivisions, or it can be a Dynamesh versus a quad mesh. But yeah, what I basically did here, I went to geometry, did a quick Z-Remesh, and you'll see this thing is actually going to be very, very low poly. I'm going to set it to 5,000 right now. May take a minute or two to calculate. You know, the higher the polygon count you are working from, the longer this tool will take. So a lot of times if I want to just start testing rigging, I want to just start testing certain things, right? So look at that. Look at that mesh. It's pretty good, right? Pretty awesome. And it follows the anatomical structure very, very well. But if I hit Control D, right, to add divisions, you see I don't have the detail. Well, check this out. If I go into the subtool palette, I have the new version selected. This is the, and if we turn off solo mode, you can see there's kind of an overlap. You can actually do this thing called project. What that literally does is project or copy the detail from the Dynamesh detailed edition over to the new cleaner version with the quads and subdivisions, so I don't lose any detail. So you can go back and forth, back and forth. So if I take a look now, here's my clean quad version with the detail transferred over, right? It's magic. Like I said, alien technology from the future. So yeah, coming back to this, there's Sculptris mode. So what Sculptris does is kind of amazing too. So this is a fairly new mode inside of ZBrush. So I'll hit X here, rotate to my kind of front view. If you're in the standard brush, right, it actually gives you detail as you sculpt. So what is it doing? This is called dynamic tessellation. So as you brush stroke, it is actually adding more mesh detail locally. Now it is triangulated, and I've told you guys before, triangles are generally kind of bad because it's harder to work with, but that's okay because we can Z-remesh it later, right? Or we can make a new topology later. What's also amazing is if you hold shift down, it actually will reduce the poly count in areas. So as the detail goes away, so does the poly count. So it makes your model really, really efficient. It's kind of amazing. And if we do something like snake hook, remember when I did it in with Dynamesh on, I lost mesh, but I can almost like infinitely pull things out, right? And if I smooth things away enough, it melts it away to nothing. And if I inflate, it'll inflate. And if I, you know, bridge this stuff together, it'll eventually connect it. If I can get it to connect. Let me try to inflate that. There we go. So it'll actually start to merge together. And if I smooth it away, it'll clean it up. It's kind of amazing. ZBrush basically, or the makers of ZBrush, bought a software called Sculptress. It was its own separate tiny little sculpting software, and it basically worked like this. And they just kind of sat on it for like 7 years until they fully integrated it in the most recent edition of ZBrush. And I'm very excited about it because for me, I find Dynamesh, every time I have to control, click, and drag to kind of redivide the mesh, it kind of breaks me out of the creative process. There are some more settings to Sculptress that I personally haven't explored yet, but I personally think this will be the better kind of conceptual tool for a lot of artists. So if you guys want to play with any of those modes, feel free, go ahead, and if you have any questions, let me know. I will mention one thing though with Sculptress. If you snake hook, it will add new mesh, but if you're just using the move tool, it does not add the mesh. The reason for that is that sometimes you just want to make like, the move tool is generally used as like a positioning tool, so if you want to kind of make a face shape, a body shape, or whatever, you want to keep your forms, right? You will often use the move brush to make those major changes. And I use the move brush a lot, especially in the early phases. So right, if you're making some sort of creature or whatever, then you're going to want to sort of set things up with the move tool. And then after, you know, I use a damn standard, let's say, and again, this is in Sculptress mode, so you'll see it dynamically add divisions there, right? So it's a really, really incredible tool.